Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald entered the world on July 22, 1890, in a Boston divided by invisible borders. On one side stood the city's old Protestant elite, who controlled the banks, universities, and boardrooms. On the other stood Irish Catholic families, many only one generation removed from poverty, fighting for influence through politics instead of inherited wealth. Among them, no politician drew a crowd quite like Rose's father, John Francis Fitzgerald. Boston knew him simply as Honey Fitz. He remembered names with astonishing precision, sang at campaign rallies, laughed easily with factory workers, and could fill an entire street with supporters before his opponents realized an election had begun. To thousands of immigrants, he represented hope. To his rivals, he was one of the most dangerous political operators in Massachusetts. Rose admired him completely. As a little girl, she stood beside him at public events, greeted party leaders, poured tea for influential guests, and watched her father transform every conversation into an opportunity. Politics wasn't discussed in the Fitzgerald home. It was lived every day. While other children played in the streets, Rose learned how alliances were built, how reputations were protected, and how appearances could determine a family's future. Without realizing it, she was being trained for a role she had never chosen. As she grew older, Rose developed ambitions of her own. She dreamed of attending Wellesley College, one of America's finest universities for women, believing education would open a life beyond Boston's political circles. Her father had different plans. Influenced by Boston's powerful Catholic hierarchy, he decided that his daughter belonged in religious schools where discipline, obedience, and faith mattered more than independence. Rose's future changed with a single decision she never made herself. Instead of Wellesley, she entered convent schools where every day followed the same rigid rhythm of prayer, study, silence, and sacrifice. The sisters taught that suffering strengthened character, that a faithful wife endured hardship without complaint, and that marriage was a sacred promise carrying obligations no disappointment could erase. Rose embraced those lessons with remarkable devotion. She attended Mass faithfully, obeyed authority without public resistance, and gradually learned to hide disappointment behind composure. Those closest to her rarely heard her complain. It was a habit that would define the rest of her life. Looking back, biographers would identify this period as the moment Rose began mastering the quiet discipline for which the world would later admire her. Few realized that the same discipline would also become the prison from which she never escaped. Then, during the summer of 1906, while vacationing with her family at Old Orchard Beach in Maine, 16-year-old Rose met a young man whose ambition rivaled that of her father. Joseph Patrick Kennedy was only 2 years older, but even as a teenager, he carried himself with unusual confidence. He spoke about business instead of sports, investments instead of entertainment, and seemed less interested in enjoying the present than conquering the future. Their attraction was immediate. Their family's reaction was not. Behind polite introductions lay one of Boston's fiercest political rivalries. Honey Fitz and Joseph's father, P. J. Kennedy, belonged to competing political machines that battled for influence, votes, and power. To Honey Fitz, the son of his greatest rival was the last man he wanted courting his daughter. What began as a teenage romance soon became a struggle between two of Boston's most powerful Irish Catholic families. Honey Fitz believed distance would solve the problem. Instead, it transformed a young romance into a test of patience that neither Rose nor Joseph had any intention of losing. Honey Fitz had spent his entire career defeating men like P. J. Kennedy. The idea that his daughter might marry into the Kennedy family was more than a personal disappointment. It was a political defeat. He acted quickly. In 1908, Rose was sent to Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York. Officially, it was an opportunity to continue her education. Unofficially, it placed nearly 200 miles between her and Joseph Kennedy. The strategy failed. Joseph wrote constantly. Every letter carried the same quiet determination that would later define his business career. Distance became an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. Honey Fitz responded with an even bolder move. Rose was sent across the Atlantic to Europe, where she attended convent schools in Germany and later in Paris. She immersed herself in French, German, literature, history, and Catholic theology. The schools refined her manners and broadened her education, but they also reinforced a philosophy that would shape every major decision she made as an adult. A woman's greatest strength, she was taught, was not independence but endurance. Patience was a virtue. Sacrifice was honorable. Marriage was permanent. Suffering carried spiritual value. These lessons were not temporary classroom discussions. They became the framework through which Rose would eventually interpret nearly every hardship she faced. Back in Boston, Joseph Kennedy was transforming himself. While Honeyfitz tried to separate the young couple by oceans, Joseph built the kind of success that even his critics could not ignore. Barely in his 20s, he became president of Columbia Trust Company, making headlines as one of the youngest bank presidents in America. Every promotion strengthened his position. Every business success weakened Honeyfitz's argument that Joseph lacked the stature to marry his daughter. Nearly 8 years had passed since Rose and Joseph first met on the beaches of Maine. The young man Honeyfitz had dismissed as the son of a political rival had become one of Boston's fastest rising businessmen. Persistence accomplished what distance never could. On October 7, 1914, inside the private chapel of Cardinal William O'Connell, the same church leader who years earlier had encouraged Rose's convent education, Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph P. Kennedy. There were no enormous crowds, no elaborate public celebration, and no grand political spectacle. The ceremony was intimate, almost restrained, considering the prominence of both families. Afterward, the newlyweds settled into a comfortable home in Brookline, Massachusetts, believing they were beginning the life they had fought nearly a decade to build. The marriage began with genuine optimism. Joseph possessed relentless ambition. Rose possessed extraordinary discipline. Together, they appeared perfectly suited to build an exceptional family. Their first child, Joseph Jr., arrived less than a year later. John followed in 1917. Rosemary was born during the influenza pandemic of 1918. Kathleen arrived in 1920. For children entered the household in just 6 years, while Joseph spent more time pursuing opportunity than enjoying domestic life. His business interests expanded rapidly into banking, shipbuilding, investments, and eventually Wall Street. Weeks often passed with Joseph away from home, chasing deals that promised larger fortunes. Rose remained behind, managing pregnancies, raising young children, supervising the household, and maintaining the appearance of calm expected from the wife of a rising public figure. Friends admired her efficiency. Visitors praised the order inside the Kennedy home. Few noticed how isolated she had become. The marriage she had waited nearly 8 years to begin was already becoming a partnership divided by ambition, duty, and long absences. Before the decade ended, Rose would reach a breaking point that almost changed the course of the Kennedy family forever. By 1920, Rose Kennedy was 30 years old, exhausted, and expecting her fifth child. Joseph's fortune was growing at a pace few Americans could match, but every new business venture seemed to take him farther from home. He spent nights at shipyards during the First World War, weeks negotiating financial deals, and increasingly longer periods chasing opportunities that promised greater wealth. Newspapers celebrated his rise as one of Boston's brightest young businessmen. At home, Rose measured time differently. Her calendar was marked by pregnancies, childhood illnesses, sleepless nights, and the endless rhythm of caring for 4 young children while preparing for another. The Kennedy home never lacked money. It lacked presence. Visitors admired the immaculate house, the well-behaved children, and the calm woman who seemed to manage everything effortlessly. What they rarely saw was the loneliness hidden beneath that composure. The life Rose had imagined during those years of waiting and courtship had quietly become something else. She was no longer sharing a future with Joseph. She was maintaining one while he built an empire elsewhere. Late that year, something happened that almost erased the Kennedy dynasty before it truly began. Rose packed her belongings, gathered her children, and returned to her parents' home in Dorchester. Family accounts agree on one essential fact: she intended to leave her husband. After years of separation, repeated pregnancies, and emotional isolation, she had reached the point where she believed the marriage could no longer continue. For the first time since their wedding, Rose chose herself over duty. She arrived at the house where she had grown up expecting comfort, guidance, or perhaps simply permission to begin again. Instead, she encountered the man whose approval had shaped her entire life. Honeyfitz listened to his daughter's plea, but history records no dramatic embrace, no father defending his wounded child, and no invitation to remain. Later family recollections describe his response with painful simplicity. A married Catholic woman did not leave her husband. Whatever happened inside her marriage belonged inside her marriage. Whether every word remembered decades later was spoken exactly as recalled can never be proven, but the outcome is undisputed. Rose was not welcome home. Within weeks, she returned to Joseph. That journey back to Brookline became one of the most important decisions in Kennedy history. Rose never attempted to leave again. Over the next 12 years, she gave birth to 5 more children: Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward, raising a family of 9 while Joseph expanded his fortune into Wall Street, Hollywood, and eventually international politics. Friends noticed a subtle change in her after 1920. She no longer seemed to expect emotional companionship from her marriage. Instead, she built a world she alone could control. Every day followed a schedule. Every child followed routines. Every appointment, vaccination, school activity, and household responsibility was carefully organized. Order replaced expectation. Faith replaced complaint. Silence replaced confrontation. Looking back, it is tempting to ask why she stayed. The better question may be this: after the only door that might have offered escape quietly closed, what choice did Rose Kennedy believe remained? The answer would become painfully clear when Joseph's growing success carried him into Hollywood and into the arms of another woman. By the late 1920s, Joseph Kennedy had become one of the most influential businessmen in America. Banking had made him wealthy. Wall Street had multiplied that wealth. Now Hollywood promised something even more intoxicating: power over an industry that shaped the dreams of millions. Joseph invested heavily in motion pictures, acquiring studios and financing productions while spending increasing amounts of time in California. It was there that he met Gloria Swanson. She was one of the biggest stars of the silent film era, admired around the world for her beauty, confidence, and commanding presence on screen. Their professional relationship quickly became personal. Joseph financed her productions, managed portions of her business affairs, and before long they were carrying on an affair that was well known within Hollywood's inner circles. Neither attempted to disguise it among friends. They were both married, yet they moved through elite social circles with remarkable confidence, behaving less like people hiding a secret than two powerful individuals who believed the normal rules no longer applied to them. Then came the voyage that would become one of the most astonishing episodes in Kennedy history. In November 1928, Joseph booked passage aboard the luxurious French liner Ile de France for a transatlantic crossing to Europe. Rose joined him. So did Gloria Swanson. Joseph arranged the trip himself. Day after day, the three shared meals at the same table. They strolled the decks beneath the Atlantic sky, attended concerts, and appeared together before curious passengers who struggled to understand the unusual arrangement. Gloria would later write that Rose treated her with extraordinary kindness throughout the voyage. There were no public arguments, no icy confrontations, no emotional scenes. Rose asked after Gloria's health, smiled politely, and carried herself with the same dignity she displayed everywhere else. To those watching, she appeared completely composed. Yet the silence itself became the mystery. How could any wife endure such humiliation without protest? The question would follow Rose for the rest of her life. Years later, Gloria Swanson reflected on those 6 days and admitted she never understood Rose Kennedy. In her memoir, she searched for an explanation but could never settle on one. Perhaps Rose was a saint whose faith allowed her to forgive what others never could. Perhaps she was naive enough to ignore what stood plainly before her. Or perhaps, Swanson concluded, Rose was the greatest actress on that ship, concealing emotions so completely that no one, not even the woman sharing her husband's affection, could see beneath the surface. Historians have wrestled with those same possibilities ever since because Rose herself refused to answer the question. She left behind no letter describing that voyage, no diary entry expressing anger, and no conversation with friends explaining how she truly felt. The silence that began in childhood had become absolute. Joseph's affair with Gloria eventually ended, but the pattern did not. Rumors linked him to actresses, secretaries, and other women throughout the following decades. Rose responded exactly as she had aboard the Ile de France. She said nothing publicly. She said nothing privately that history has ever found. Her children would later remember a household where arguments were almost unheard of, but they would also grow up believing that certain subjects simply did not exist. That silence became part of the Kennedy family's inheritance, passing quietly from one generation to the next. If Joseph Kennedy built the family's fortune through relentless ambition, Rose Kennedy built its discipline through routine. Every morning began the same way. Before most of the household stirred, Rose attended Massachusetts. Faith was not simply part of her day. It became the structure around which every hour revolved. She returned home, reviewed schedules, supervised tutors, checked schoolwork, organized meals, and monitored the health of each child with remarkable precision. She kept thousands of handwritten index cards recording illnesses, vaccinations, dental appointments, report cards, shoe sizes, and even personality traits. Nothing escaped her attention. If one of the children needed correction, Rose often wrote a short note instead of raising her voice. The children soon learned that a slip of paper pinned to their clothing could carry more weight than a lecture. Order became the language of the Kennedy household. Emotion rarely entered the conversation. Visitors admired the efficiency. Few recognized it as a system carefully built by a woman who had stopped expecting emotional support from the one person who had promised it. By the early 1930s, Joseph and Rose no longer shared the same bedroom. Friends who stayed at the family homes noticed the arrangement, though almost no one spoke about it publicly. Joseph continued expanding his business empire while pursuing relationships outside the marriage. Rose continued raising 9 children while maintaining the appearance of a united family. Their lives increasingly resembled two parallel paths that rarely crossed except when public duty required it. Years later, when John F. Kennedy campaigned for the presidency, he proudly told interviewers that he had never once heard his parents exchange a harsh word. In a literal sense, he was telling the truth. Arguments require conversation. By then, Joseph and Rose had perfected something quieter. They had learned to live beside one another without discussing the subjects most capable of destroying the marriage. The children mistook silence for harmony because they had never seen anything else. Then came the child who would change the family forever. Rosemary Kennedy had been born during the influenza pandemic of 1918 after a difficult delivery that many later believed deprived her brain of oxygen. As she grew older, her development never matched that of her brothers and sisters. She learned slowly, struggled in school, and found ordinary tasks increasingly difficult as adulthood approached. Yet she possessed a warm personality and desperately wanted the acceptance her family expected from every Kennedy child. During her teenage years, her behavior became more unpredictable. She experienced sudden mood swings, moments of frustration, and occasionally slipped away from the convent school where she lived. Joseph saw something different. By then, he had already begun imagining one of his sons becoming president of the United States. The Kennedy name was becoming nationally recognized. To Joseph, Rosemary's condition threatened not only her future, but the reputation he had spent decades constructing. In 1941, after consulting physicians promoting a controversial new procedure called a lobotomy, Joseph made a decision without informing most of his family. It would become the most devastating choice of his life, and one that Rose would carry in silence for decades. In November 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was 23 years old. She smiled easily, loved to dance, and wrote affectionate letters to her family in careful, uneven handwriting. Those who spent time with her remembered a gentle young woman who desperately wanted to belong. Joseph Kennedy saw something else. His oldest son was already being prepared for national leadership. Another son was showing extraordinary promise. The Kennedy name was becoming increasingly associated with success, discipline, and excellence. Rosemary did not fit the image Joseph believed the family needed to protect. As her occasional mood swings became more difficult to manage, he feared that one public incident could damage everything he had spent decades building. Psychiatry was entering an experimental era, and 2 physicians, Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, promoted a new operation that they claimed could calm troubled minds. They called it a lobotomy. Across America, hospitals described the procedure as a breakthrough. Thousands of families were persuaded that it offered hope where medicine had failed. Joseph listened carefully. He made his decision. Rosemary would undergo the operation. The procedure took place at George Washington University Hospital. Rosemary remained awake while the surgeons slowly cut connections inside the frontal lobes of her brain. They asked her questions throughout the operation, listening as she counted, answered simple prompts, and spoke normally. As her responses became slower and increasingly incoherent, the surgeons continued. When she could no longer answer, they stopped. The operation had lasted less than an hour. The damage would last the rest of her life. Rosemary emerged unable to speak clearly, unable to walk without assistance, and unable to care for herself. The daughter Joseph hoped to help had disappeared forever. The vibrant young woman who loved parties, music, and family gatherings would never again live independently. Modern medicine now recognizes the devastating consequences of lobotomies, but in 1941, many physicians still viewed the procedure as a legitimate treatment. Joseph believed he was making a responsible decision. History would judge it very differently. Rose's role in the decision has remained one of the most debated questions among Kennedy historians. Some biographers believe Joseph acted largely on his own, informing his wife only after the operation had been performed. Others, drawing on later correspondence and medical records, conclude that Rose understood far more than she publicly admitted. What happened afterward is not disputed. Rosemary was quietly placed in institutions, first in New York and later at St. Coletta in Wisconsin, where she would spend the remaining 56 years of her life. Visitors became rare. Family photographs no longer included her. For decades, most Americans had no idea that one of the Kennedy children was still alive. Publicly, the family described Rosemary as intellectually disabled from birth. The lobotomy was almost never mentioned. The daughter who had once filled the Kennedy home with laughter gradually disappeared from public memory, while her brothers moved closer to the political future their father had imagined. Inside the family, another silence settled into place, perhaps the deepest silence Rose Kennedy would ever carry. The operation on Rosemary was barely 3 years behind them when another tragedy struck with terrifying speed. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the eldest son, had been raised with a single purpose. From childhood, his father believed he would become the first Kennedy to reach the White House. Handsome, intelligent, confident, and fiercely competitive, Joe Jr. carried the expectations of an entire family on his shoulders. During the Second World War, he volunteered for dangerous combat missions with the United States Navy. By 1944, he had already completed enough operations to return home safely, but when a top-secret mission called Operation Aphrodite required experienced pilots, he volunteered again. The plan was unlike anything attempted before. His aircraft would be loaded with more than 10 tons of explosives, flown toward occupied Europe, and abandoned moments before a remote control system guided it into a German military target. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. and his co-pilot climbed into the modified bomber and lifted off from England. They never reached the point where they were supposed to parachute to safety. Without warning, the explosives detonated prematurely. The aircraft disappeared in a massive fireball high above the English countryside. There were no survivors. Joseph Kennedy, Jr. was 29 years old. The news shattered the Kennedy family. Joseph Kennedy Sr., who had spent decades preparing his eldest son for the presidency, reportedly locked himself inside his room for days, refusing visitors as the weight of his ambition collapsed around him. The future he had carefully planned disappeared in a single explosion. Rose grieved differently. Those close to the family later recalled that she gathered her children and gave them an instruction that would become one of the defining principles of the Kennedy household. Tears, she believed, could not change what had happened. The living still needed strength. Public sorrow, in her view, only deepened suffering. Whether those exact words were spoken precisely as later remembered, the family's behavior afterward reflected that philosophy. Grief would be carried quietly. Pain would remain private. Duty would continue. Decades later, after the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy, many Americans admired the remarkable composure shown by members of the family. Few realized that discipline had been forged long before Dallas or Los Angeles. It began in 1944, when a mother buried her firstborn son and decided that survival required silence. The war claimed another Kennedy only 4 years later. Kathleen Kennedy, known throughout the family as Kit, possessed an adventurous spirit that often placed her at odds with her deeply religious mother. During the war, she married William Cavendish, heir to one of Britain's greatest aristocratic families. Rose strongly opposed the marriage because Cavendish was Protestant, and she refused to attend the wedding. For months later, William was killed by a German sniper while serving in Belgium. Kathleen was widowed at just 24 years old. She eventually fell in love again, this time with Peter Fitzwilliam, a married British nobleman whose divorce had not yet been finalized. To Rose, the relationship violated every religious principle she had spent a lifetime defending. Family tensions deepened as Kathleen prepared to introduce Peter to her father in Paris. She never arrived. On May 13, 1948, the small aircraft carrying Kathleen and Peter encountered violent weather over France and crashed into a mountainside, killing everyone aboard. Kathleen was only 28. Joseph traveled to England for her funeral. Rose did not. Different explanations have been offered over the years, but the absence became another moment that puzzled historians and divided biographers. Within 4 years, the Kennedy family had buried 2 children. The dynasty Joseph dreamed of building was becoming something else entirely, a family whose extraordinary success would increasingly be measured alongside extraordinary loss.
On December 19, 1961, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. finished a round of golf in Palm Beach and returned home complaining that he did not feel well. Moments later, a massive stroke struck without warning. The man who had spent 4 decades directing businesses, investments, political campaigns, and the lives of his children collapsed to the floor. He survived, but the stroke left him partially paralyzed and almost completely unable to speak. For the remaining 8 years of his life, one of the most commanding voices in American business was reduced to a single word he could still force from his lips: no. It was a cruel irony. Joseph had built his empire by persuasion, negotiation, and absolute control. Now he could neither command nor explain. Decisions were made around him rather than by him. Nurses cared for him. Family members interpreted his expressions. The man who had shaped the Kennedy dynasty could no longer shape his own days. Rose responded with the same discipline that had defined her entire adult life. She continued attending early morning mass. She maintained her routines, played golf, managed correspondence, and visited Joseph at scheduled times rather than remaining constantly at his bedside. Some later interpreted her distance as emotional coldness. Others believed it reflected the marriage they had quietly lived for decades. Professional nurses and relatives handled most of Joseph's daily care, while Rose preserved the orderly rhythm that had carried her through every previous tragedy. Then, before the family could fully adjust to Joseph's condition, history delivered another blow. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation watched in disbelief as the young president's motorcade became the scene of one of the most shocking murders in American history. Inside Hyannisport, Joseph sat before a television, unable to speak as images of the son who had inherited his political dreams filled the screen. 6 years later, on June 5, 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was shot moments after winning the California Democratic presidential primary. He died the following day. Again, Joseph watched another son taken from him, while trapped inside a body that could no longer express grief beyond a single word. By the time Joseph Kennedy died in 1969, the family he had spent a lifetime building had endured losses few American families could imagine. One son killed in war, one daughter permanently disabled after a disastrous operation, another daughter killed in a plane crash, one son assassinated as President of the United States, another assassinated while seeking the presidency himself. To the public, the Kennedy name had become inseparable from triumph and tragedy. Rose, however, continued living much as she always had. She attended church each morning, maintained her routines, and rarely allowed emotion to become public. In 1974, she published her memoir, Times to Remember. Readers expected intimate reflections on one of America's most famous families. Instead, they found a carefully controlled account. Joseph's affairs were absent. Gloria Swanson was never mentioned. Rosemary's lobotomy was presented without revealing the devastating operation that had transformed her life. The marriage appeared stable. The family appeared united. Decades of private suffering remained hidden behind measured prose. The woman who had carried so many unspoken burdens chose once again to protect the image of the Kennedy family rather than reveal the cost of preserving it. Only after her death would history discover the pages she never intended the world to read.
When Rose Kennedy died on January 22, 1995, she was 104 years old. Presidents attended her funeral. World leaders paid tribute. Newspapers called her the indomitable matriarch of America's greatest political family. To the public, she represented unwavering faith, extraordinary discipline, and remarkable resilience. Yet the woman they mourned was, in many ways, still a mystery. She had outlived 4 of her 9 children.
Rosemary remained alive in Wisconsin, living quietly in the care of others after more than half a century away from the family's public life. Joseph had been gone for 26 years. The great Kennedy dynasty continued, but the generation that had built it was almost entirely gone. Rose took many of her deepest thoughts with her, leaving historians to search through the fragments she chose not to destroy. 11 years after her death, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library opened hundreds of boxes containing Rose Kennedy's private correspondence, journals, calendars, and handwritten notes. Scholars expected to find confirmation of the serene, composed woman presented in her memoir. Instead, they discovered someone far more complex. Hidden among thousands of pages were moments of loneliness, anxiety, exhaustion, and private sorrow that almost never appeared in public. The woman who rarely complained aloud had quietly recorded fears for her children, worries about their health, periods of depression, and the emotional burden of maintaining a household while her husband pursued wealth and influence. The contrast was striking. The public Rose Kennedy had become a symbol of perfect composure. The private Rose Kennedy struggled with many of the same doubts, disappointments, and heartaches experienced by countless mothers. She simply refused to let the world see them. The papers also revealed something else. Rose had spent decades carefully protecting the Kennedy image, often at tremendous personal cost. She omitted Joseph's affairs from her memoir. She never publicly explained Rosemary's lobotomy. She rarely challenged the official family narrative, even when later evidence complicated it. Some historians believe she sacrificed her own voice to preserve the legacy of her husband and children. Others argue that she exercised quiet power, understanding that controlling the family's story was itself a form of influence. Her daughter Eunice eventually transformed one of the family's greatest tragedies into one of its greatest achievements by founding the Special Olympics, inspired in large part by Rosemary's life. Millions of athletes around the world would benefit from a movement that might never have existed had Rosemary's suffering remained completely hidden. In one remarkable twist, the child whose existence the family once tried hardest to protect from public view became the inspiration for one of the world's most important organizations dedicated to people with intellectual disabilities. The Kennedy story had always been one of contradictions: extraordinary success and devastating loss, public triumph and private sacrifice, great ambition and profound silence. Only after Rose's death did history begin to understand that behind America's most famous family stood a woman whose greatest battles were fought where almost no one could see them.